Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar this evening, which is being hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb and AHDB Dairy. My name's Amy Fawcett. I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. So I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on improving dairy-bred calf health, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Tim Potter from Westpoint Farm Vets. So the plan of action is that Tim will run through his presentation and then there'll be time for questions at the end. You guys will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anybody does want to ask a question, then just type it in the box on the right-hand side of your screen and I'll read those out at the end. So we've got over 140 people registered for the webinar this evening, which is a great turnout, and I'd just like to thank Elena, who's working in the background just to trying to keep the all the technology running as smoothly as possible. We don't usually encounter any difficulties, but if we do, just bear with us. We'll obviously try and keep these to a minimum. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. So welcome to tonight's webinar. So I've been asked to talk through improving a dairy-bred calf health. In terms of an overview, key topics that we decided to have a look at through tonight: colostrum management, touch on some aspects of milk replacer, look a bit at individual versus paired housing, and I think within that just talk a bit about housing in general, some of the key things to think about. That then leads into hygiene, and then the final focus of the presentation is to look at one of the key diseases that we see in calves of this ilk and this age group, so the pneumonia, so bovine respiratory disease. So anytime that we end up talking about calf health and the performance of calves, it would be remiss not to talk about colostrum. We could spend a lot of time talking about the other aspects of this presentation in terms of nutrition in the first period on milk, talk about housing, talk about preventatives, vaccinations and all this. And actually, if you haven't got the calf off to the right start with its colostrum, you can the effect of the other things can be limited. So the colostrum aspect, yes, we are talking about calves that often people are rearing. They may not have direct links in with the source farm that they've come from, but I think it's always worth remembering that impact of colostrum and also thinking about potential ways that you can look out for signs of good colostrum feeding, potentially identify problems as calves come into units if you're a calf rearer, or think of it as an opportunity as to potentially is this something that actually you want to engage with other farms or source farms that you're getting calves from, and think about that actually it's probably beneficial for both parties. So as a calf rearer, if you're getting good calves having been fed good colostrum, potentially you're going to have a much lower incidence of disease, much better performing calves. So actually, is it worth thinking about engaging with your source farms, thinking about that direct supply, and whether or not there is some way that you can work together with people to make the system work better. So want to do a couple of slides just reminding everyone about colostrum. Firstly, what is colostrum? Everyone should know that that's that first milk secreted by the mammary gland for the first 24 hours after the birth of the calf. Contains immunoglobulins, so these are the proteins that are really responsible for the health of the animal. So they're the ones that are providing immunity. Good source of protein, source of energy for that calf, vitamin, minerals, and then gut growth factors. The quality of it will vary. And will be impacted by a number of different things. So traditionally people talk about the fact that colostrum from heifers is worse and of poorer quality than that of cows, mainly because of what they've been exposed to in terms of disease challenge or vaccination programs and things. So actually cow colostrum tends to be better. But other things will have a negative impact on colostrum. So if you've got a sick cow, that will have a negative impact on the quality of the colostrum from her. Why is it important? Newborn animals do not have a fully developed immune system. So they're reliant on those immunoglobulins coming from the colostrum for the sort of disease, to sort of fight off disease in the early part of life. And we're not just talking the first 24 hours, we're talking that sort of probably that first 6 to 8 week period. So animals that have had poor colostrum, it will have a negative impact on them for a lot of the rearing period, and certainly whilst they're on milk and up until weaning, it is a dramatic effect. The intestine is going through a process of development, so when the calf is born, it is not fully developed, and actually the immunoglobulins, so the IGs in the slide here, help protect the gut from pathogens. And so please don't underestimate the impact of colostrum, and it's a one way of delivering immunity and protection to the calves immediately after they're born. A lot of research has gone on in terms of the colostrum and its impact on long-term performance. And table here summarizes some of the papers out there, start putting some figures on why do we put so much emphasis on colostrum? Why is it whenever people talk about calf health, colostrum comes to the fore? And I think the table sort of neatly summarizes some of the areas where there's positive gains to be made by ensuring that those calves receive adequate colostrum. So with a low, on the left hand side, we've got the different parameters, so weight difference at 205 days, live weight gain, age at slaughter, vet costs and things like that. Then 3 columns, low, medium and high, and what we're talking about there is the sort of actually the quality is we've graded those based on the sort of the provision of colostrum. So low being those calves that have received insufficient or poor quality colostrum, going over to better quality, so the high quality colostrum. So it demonstrates what can be achieved by ensuring calves get the right start. So in terms of weight difference at 205 days, those animals that have have been classified as having a good quality colostrum intake exceeding or exceeding the expected levels will be expected to have increased weight at 205 days, increased growth rates, reduced age at slaughter. So all aspects that are going to be key for us in terms of when we start looking at the profitability of beef enterprises, things that we're looking at in terms of trying to make sure performance is where it should be, and animals are going to achieve their potential, and also that we are going to keep down the costs. So making sure that actually we've got an animal that's going to go through a system, not succumb to disease, and also it has a long-term effect. So here we've got some aspects on for those of you that are looking at this from the dairy sector. In heifers, there's been a lot of work tracking the impact of colostrum on the long-term performance, and the lactation milk yields is higher in animals that have had sufficient colostrum, both in the first lactation and the second lactation, and basically we see an increase in that in production. And a lot of that will be, it's sort of intertwined with regards to sort of the disease resilience of those animals. So basically making sure we've had enough colostrum will minimize disease, making sure that we sort of minimize the chance of the detrimental effect that those diseases will have on the growth and the performance of the animals, no matter what sector that they're going into. In terms of what we're doing, in terms of getting the colostrum in there, we have a very limited window to get that colostrum into the animal. So we can talk at length about what affects quality of the colostrum. So the quality is going to be affected by, as we said before, age of the mum. So heifers versus cows tending to have a better quality colostrum. The fact that we end up with sort of disease having a negative impact on the colostrum of the animal. If nutrition will have an impact, so if the cow has had a poor plane of nutrition, she's been losing condition, colostrum will be of a poorer quality. There is also a tendency that what we find, certainly in the dairy sector, where animals have been selected much more for yields, that there is a finite amount of immunoglobulins produced by a cow. So if that number is going into an udder that's producing large volumes of milk, so we've got a very milky cow with high yields, the tendency is the colostrum is slightly poorer quality because it's a dilution factor. So these are things to bear in mind, and the guidelines in terms of colostrum feeding are all based around how do we take that knowledge to make sure that we can, in every instance, get the best possible start for animals. And actually it's achievable. A lot of farms where there's active processes going on in terms of monitoring colostrum feeding practices will be able to achieve 100% sort of hit rate in terms of getting all animals receiving adequate quality colostrum. The graph here demonstrates one of the issues with colostrum feeding and this whole idea about why we focus very much on that first few hours of life. The colostrum, unfortunately, has a limited period of production, so we're only seeing it in that first 24 hours of production from the mum, but then also the calf has limited ability to absorb it after 24 hours. So we start at sort of immediately after birth, with the calf having the ability to absorb the most possible immunoglobulins, but then this will rapidly decline as the sort of the gut changes and matures in the first 24 hours of birth. So we are very much up against the clock in terms of making sure we need to get that colostrum into the animal. So based on that, there's guidelines out there, and there's sort of the various rules of thumb in terms of colostrum feeding. It's always worth remembering where the sort of target should be. People talk about the 3 Qs, so quantity, quality, and quickly. These are all about providing simple guidelines to allow people to sort of target getting the most getting best quality colostrum into the calf and making sure that all calves get the best possible start. So in terms of quantity, recommendation is to get 3 litres or 10% of body weight of the calf as soon as possible after birth, and then follow up again within 12 hours with the similar feed size. So potentially within the first 12 hours of life or just after, and certainly within the first 24 hours, all calves should have got that sort of 6 litres of colostrum. In terms of quality, good quality colostrum contains at least 50 grams of litre of IgG, and then for people that are monitoring it, so there are various tools out there, refractometers or colostrometers for checking the quality of colostrum. Anything sort of less than 20 grams per litre probably shouldn't be used, or if it's going to be used, think about using a supplements to sort of to make sure that we're providing the best possible start and supplementing where appropriate. And quickly, so the previous slide we talked about the fact that the gut has got limited limited time frame in which it can absorb colostrum, and we need to ensure that actually we hit that window. So getting that colostrum in as quickly as possible is really important. And I suppose it's all very well and good, and I think probably some people would sit out there going, right, you're talking about colostrum management. I don't necessarily have direct control over this. I'm buying calves from market, I'm buying them from dairy farms and then rearing them. It's not something that I have control over. But I think the way things are going within the markets, the way that we're seeing a lot more integrated chains, there's a lot more sort of possibility for feeding back to source dairy farms, or potentially opportunities to work with dairy farms to say, well, actually, if you've got people local to you that are calving and you're identifying them as source farms, talk to them about what they're doing in terms of their colostrum management. There are the guidelines are out there in terms of the 3 Qs, so that quantity, quality, quickly. There are ways of monitoring colostrum quality. So the colostrometer in the photo on the right measures the density of the colostrum, and that gives us an indicator of colostrum quality. And then it's also possible to blood sample calves. So we do a lot of work on farms where we're monitoring the colostrum feeding practices by blood sampling calves, and that gives us an indicator of whether or not calves are receiving sufficient colostrum. And it's worth this sort of feedback and this sort of engagement with source farms. It may be a case that actually, even when you're doing your disease monitoring, you start to identify patterns, and this is where you might not necessarily look directly at what's going on in terms of colostrum, but you may be sourcing calves local to you or through markets, and you start to identify trends in terms of calves that are more prone to disease in the first sort of few weeks when they're on the calf rearing units. And I think it's certainly worth sort of identifying risk farms, or potentially working identifying farms that on the other side are always constantly providing good quality calves, because actually those are the ones to engage with in terms of supply. And the paper referenced at the bottom here, this is a survey done in Canada, sort of results published this year, looked at the management practices for male calves on Canadian dairy farms. And yes, it's a Canadian study, but I think what it highlights is sometimes there is a variation of what goes on in terms of the management of bull calves on the dairy farms. It's a sort of one of those sort of people talk about anecdotally, and the fact that the dairy farmers are always interested in the heifers, and that they tend to be prioritized. But I think, and there is a little bit of a difference there, but actually if people engage in sort of the young stock health across all calves, actually everyone benefits from it. And the study there in Canada identified probably about the sort of, certainly there was only about 9% sort of came back and said, oh, they don't feed any colostrum to bull calves. And certainly I'm not aware of what the figure within the UK is, and hopefully there's sort of, this figure would be even lower in the UK, is sort of based on the sort of welfare and what the guidelines should be out there in terms of colostrum feeding. We certainly shouldn't be depriving bull calves of any colostrum feeding. But the study also highlighted the differences in potential feeding practices, and it's worth being aware of what goes on and sort of working out ways that we can sort of join up the industry and make sure that actually these bull calves are getting the best possible start in life. So moving on from colostrum, and say if we don't have the opportunity of working directly with farms, or you're looking at sort of bringing calves into a rearing unit, what are the signs to look for, and how do we identify those at-risk ones? If you're dealing with farms, you know the history of, think about disease control, so known disease status, looking at sort of trying to eradicate things like BVD. So I look at whether or not you're sourcing from farms that have BVD, or are testing animals and removing PI calves. So there's a big push in terms of sort of, and I would encourage everyone to look at BVD eradication in terms of the sort of improving the health and sort of performance of beef animals. But it's a sort of, what other signs can you look for? And I think it's basically remembering at the end of the day that sort of the poorer looking calf may look like it's a deal at the time in terms of sort of, oh yeah, it comes with a group of good calves and it's there as an extra one or whatever, but actually it can end up being a problematic animal in the long term, and actually can end up costing you more. So try and avoid bringing in animals that have shown signs of disease, and certainly don't buy anything that is showing signs of disease at the time of purchase. Check the navel, look for it being alert, bright-eyed, good confirmation, think about that, what it has in terms of the long-term performance within the beef sector. Well grown for its age, and it's worth checking animals at ages, and sort of it's all very well having a 50-kilo calf that looks great now, but if it's a month old, you then need to think about, well, actually, what's been the impact of that animal? Why hasn't it grown on from its potential? So have a think about what your targets are in terms of weight for age, and sort of avoid anything that's dull, showing signs of diarrhea, potentially showing signs of a previous incidence of diarrhea. So look out for that scalding around the back end, and sort of loss of hair, which frequently will show that potentially that animal has had a bout of diarrhea. Because those animals, if they've had disease in that initial period, will be ones that potentially will be repeat offenders later on, or are, again, it's pointing to animals that have potentially not had their sort of required colostrum, and there'll be negative impact on their performance. In terms of feeding, there's a lot of work out there in terms of whole milk versus milk replacer, different qualities, and ultimately you get what you pay for. Think about what you're doing in terms of the sort of, and the key pointers to look at is looking at the constituent parts, and making sure that actually you're following guidelines in terms of preparation, and sort of actually what and the feeding guidelines. This table here sort of summarizes what the sort of the differences between sort of what goes on in sort of fresh milk, so cow's milk, and we've got two columns there, the cow's milk as a fresh liquid, and then cow's milk as dry matter. And I think it's worth remembering that often when we're talking about milk replacer and feeding calves, get used to thinking about it in terms of grams rather than litres, because the grams is the important part. So how many grams of milk replacer am I putting into into that calf. So if it's getting 6 litres, well, I could be feeding it 6 litres of white water, or I could be feeding it 6 litres of very thick milkshake-like consistency if I've got a lot of nutrients in there. So grams is a much more comparable way. So if you're talking to anyone about what you should be feeding, yes, understand how many litres, but also understand how many grams goes into that feed, because can be a big difference in terms of performance and actually the nutritional value. So frequently we would be feeding often 125 grams of powder, maybe a sort of a good starting point for sort of milk replacer, but people will feed anything up to 100 and 150, 175 depending on the product. And that sort of, with the idea being that you then sort of think about sort of what's my target total intake, and the target total intake will depend on what you're trying to achieve in terms of growth rate. So think about where you're going with that benchmarking, and often in this period, if we're looking at sort of dairy-bred calves, good target for weight gain whilst on milk would be about 0.7 kilos per day. So a lot of people would be targeting having milk a total grammage intake of a daily of probably in the region of 700 grams per day. But remember that things will have an impact on that. So classic one that will have an impact on that will be temperature. So if we're in the cold weather, often it will be a case that actually we need to be thinking about feeding more milk to the calves. And you've got 2 options there. Do you add in extra literage, so you go from 6 litres to 8 litres, 4 litres to 6 litres, or often what's easier is just to increase the concentration? Because bear in mind, if we're putting in large quantities of litres, so if we're feeding 8 litres of milk, there's a lot of liquid going into that calf, and actually what can happen in those situations is that you are increasing the amount of liquid that comes out the back end of the calf in terms of urine and feces, and then what we end up with is sort of actually that increases the humidity in the environment and can have a negative impact on disease as well. So it may be often that you're actually better, rather than just giving an extra 2 litres of milk, you might be better thinking, well, actually I want to give 2 litres extra of milk. That translates to an extra 250 grams of milk powder. I would be better thinking about whether or not I could divide that over just adding that in as extra grams across 6 litres, rather than adding in another 2 litres of fluid into that environment. Because if you've got big groups of calves, you can imagine that rapidly we build up the amount, we're suddenly putting a lot more fluid into the environment. Was asked to talk a little bit about the sort of this individual versus group housing and individual versus paired housing. Housing is always a difficult one, and I think that there's lots of different systems out there, and I think done well, a lot of housing systems will work, and I think there's sort of key principles to think about from that point of view. The debate about sort of individual versus paired housing, so what benefit is there from sort of those single hutch type systems with one calf versus a sort of hutch with sort of 2 calves, or sort of that system whereby we're having sort of 2 calves grouped together? There is work out there that sort of demonstrates that actually the sort of social aspect of having 2 calves together helps promote higher intakes in the calves, so that whilst they're still on milk, they'll gradually take more and more of the starter feed. They tend to adjust to the weaning better, so when they're moved into group pens, and when you remove the milk, there's less vocalization and they settle into the system better. And again, when they move out of that sort of paired housing situation, what tends to be is in the first few days, certainly, the animals that have been kept in a paired environment versus the animals that have been kept on their own tend to have more visits to the hard feed. They tend to adjust to that hard feed better in terms of intakes, and so we have increased growth rates, at least that's been demonstrated in the first few weeks around whilst on milk, and immediately after weaning. That said, the system has to work for people, and I think it's worth thinking about what works for you, because a system done well, you can make an individual house system work well in the same way that you can make a group house system work well. And I think, why do people choose to raise animals individually? It's a good way of controlling disease, prevents that sort of any kind of negative interactions with each other. So in terms of bullying, sucking on each other, allows animals to feed individually, allows them to monitor them individually, but it comes with associated costs. It is a very labor-intensive way of doing it, and potentially it precludes some of the sort of automated systems that may be better for sort of large group rearing. Why do people go into group systems? Lower labor requirements in terms of sort of that. It's easier to sort of bed up and feed all at once. You do have a better socialization, and sort of that can help promote performance. And there's a lot of work out there that sort of shows that these social animals learn a lot from each other, and so there's a positive impact of sort of following on from what other calves do, so going in and sort of investigating feed troughs, milk feeders and things like that. And there's also the sort of, at least the perception of better welfare. So that we could argue either way in terms of the systems. There is science to prove that sort of actually, yeah, groups works well, but the individual has its positives as well. So it's making sure you pick the right system for you. And whichever you do, I think it's key that you're getting the same principles. Going back to colostrum, it's making sure that we get the calves started right. We need to make sure they're getting enough feed. So think about providing enough milk powder, that sort of baseline, probably in the region of 700 grams, and then potentially maybe upping to higher planes of nutrition if we need it, if the demands of the weather. So if we've got colder weather, the calf will require more milk, literally just to keep at a steady weight. If we want to build weight gain on top, we need to provide extra. Clean and dry is going to be your key thing. So in terms of comfort for the animal, minimizing disease, stress, but then also sort of if it's wet, again, the animal is going to burn extra calories trying to dry itself off, keep warm, and those calories are being spent keeping warm rather than actually what we really want them doing is going in terms of growth. Think about looking at monitoring performance and early identification of disease, which is going to be key, and that's something that we'll talk about shortly in terms of pneumonia, and thinking about ventilation. Ventilation, remember when we're talking about young animals, we stack effect and things like that. Probably that small animals, they're not generating a huge amount of heat, so they will struggle in very large spaces. So we need to think about how we potentially drive air changes. There's certainly a lot of work going on at the moment, sort of showing the advantages of sort of some of the positive pressure systems where that's allowing air changes, because a young calf does not generate the same amount of heat as a 300, 400 kilo store finishing animal that's going to really drive ventilation in the shed and sort of push fresh air around it. So it's thinking about that, okay, if I'm putting young calves into a shed, I need to avoid drafts where those calves are, but I also need to think about how I'm going to drive the air movement. Think about disinfection, and hygiene is going to be the key. There's a lot of ideas that can be borrowed from the sort of pig and poultry industry, where actually one of the things to do is sort of think about reducing moisture in the environment, but also think about the advantages of an all-in, all-out system. So being able to clean out between batches, and certainly if you're looking at it as a calf rearer, think about how can that work for your system. If you've got a couple of sheds or one large shed, what's the easiest way for you to do it? Is it that you fill up all at once in a batch and you run those animals through together, and then as they move out you can then clean out the entire shed? Or are you going to be constantly adding in animals and sort of mixing in animals? Because the second option is it may fit with regards to animals sourcing and supply, but it potentially adds greater pressure to the system in terms of constantly bringing in new disease challenges, mixing animals at different ages, and also not providing you with the opportunity to have a full cleanse and disinfect out at the end of each batch. Because actually, if you do have a disease outbreak, it's very difficult in those situations where you've got a constant stream of animals trickling into a shed for you to go, right, we get this batch out, we can cleanse and disinfect and restart over it. So there's always going to be a disease challenge within that building. You may be able to clean out individual pens, but moisture and things will build up, and that again has a negative impact on sort of humidity. One of the things to bear in mind, the good hygiene and sort of thing, is all about areas where the calf is in contact with it. Sort of photo on the top left-hand corner here, yeah, we've got a lot of standing water there, so you can imagine that actually in that environment we've got really bad humidity, and there's a lot of potential disease spread from the bedding, but it will also cool down the environment. There's going to be a lot of energy burned off just trying to evaporate that water, and so the shed will get cold as well. So if you are cleaning out sheds and things like that, spending ages hosing down work passages where the animals don't have contact. Yes, we want to keep things clean, but daily sort of spraying lots of hose pipes around, or dumping sort of buckets of water into and emptying buckets onto the floor in calf sheds all adds to the humidity. So think about what you're doing in terms of where you're disposing of dirty water, what you're doing in terms of cleaning of areas where the calves don't have access to. Similarly, where do calves produce most liquid? Where are we going to get the real build-up? Moisture is always going to build up round feeders. So think about this in terms of if you're redesigning sheds or you're thinking about setting up units. Biggest impact we get in is around the calf feeders, and where they stand up. So think about drainage there, or having the ability to scrape those out on a regular basis to try and minimize the build-up of disease and moisture in the environment. So for the last little bit, just want to talk about one of the major diseases that we have. So scours being one of them, pneumonia is sort of the one I was specifically asked to talk about today. Pneumonia is one of those diseases where I think everyone can identify, have an idea of the symptoms and signs, but it's worth just sort of thinking about what's the long-term impact of it. Graph here is some work that was published last year, where people looked at lungs of animals at slaughter, and then sort of related that to sort of daily live weight and sort of live weight gains. And what we've got there is the sort of the normal in green, the moderate and severe is all about sort of, that's how the lungs were classified when they were examined at slaughter. So normal is the lungs that showed no signs of disease. Moderate is lungs that showed that there had been evidence of disease at some point, and then severe were lungs where on inspection you'd have expected those animals to have had severe disease at some point during their lifetime. And what you can see from the graph is a very distinct trend, and sort of very much the impact of pneumonia. So those animals that are there highlighted and classified in red that had severe lung damage at slaughter, their live weight gain and the sort of live weight at through the rearing period was significantly lower than those animals that had no evidence of lesions. So you instantly see pneumonia. It's one of these diseases that has a long-term impact. It's not just about that coughing animal, that loss of that animal that dies from it, the cost of the veterinary interventions, of the antibiotics, the anti-inflammatories to treat it, but think of it as the long-term impact as well. So it's important to never underestimate that. So there's a lot to be said for investing in steps to prevent the disease. Signs of pneumonia. There are some great sort of systems out there now. The chart on the right is from the University of Wisconsin, and they sort of have a scoring system that allows sort of people to objectively sort of quantify what's going on in terms of calf pneumonia and BRD. And they look at a number of things within that. So rectal temperature, presence of cough, nasal discharge, eye scores, also look at position of the ear. So the position of the ear sort of highlights one of the diseases that's sort of seemingly emerging in a lot of the sort of calf rearing and heifer rearing programs, especially those that are bringing in animals from multiple different sources. So it's often seen as a result of infection with mycoplasma. Signs listed on the left are those ones that hopefully everyone's familiar with. So fever, so elevated temperature, nasal discharge, lacrimation, so discharge from the eye and watering from the eye, cough, increased respiratory rate, rough hair coats, depression, poor weight gain, reduced feed intake. And I think it's sort of worth bearing in mind, and it's interesting when I chat to people about pneumonia and BRD and sort of the diseases. Often I chat to people and they often say, oh, well, pneumonia is the severe form of it. So that animal that is down, really breathing very hard, and sort of may have a very high temperature and is sort of very easily identifiable sick. And then an animal that is just coughing occasionally, bit of nasal discharge, they don't necessarily always classify as pneumonia. And I would just view it all as, it's all on a sliding scale. It's all one and the same disease. And I would encourage people to make sure that actually you're identifying the disease in the early stages, because what we want to do is make sure that we minimize the impact, because that animal, that if you treat it in the early stages, we're much more likely to get better resolution, and we're less likely to have those animals fall into that severe category on the graph on the previous slide. So it have that long-term impact on the sort of the performance and the weight gain of the animal. Interesting is, so in terms of technology, say the scoring system is there, it provides you an objective tool, and that can be downloaded online. There's even an app now, I think, that you can download, and you can score pens of animals that will allow you to sort of objectively measure sort of pneumonias in groups. We're now seeing temperature detecting devices, so things that you can either sort of put into the ear of calves and that they will start flashing if the calf goes, the temperature of the animal goes up above a certain threshold, and so visually draws your attention to those animals. Similarly, the boluses there's some temperature monitoring boluses. So various tools that are out there to help with disease detection, but it doesn't take away from the need for good stockmanship. These should be viewed as sort of adjunct tools and a way of sort of helping sort of hone in what's sort of helping that identification. And I'd always encourage people to sort of work with your advisors, with your veterinary surgeons, to make sure that actually you have a clear definition of what diseases are, what your treatment policies should be, and especially if you're going down the line of using some of these aids to detection, so that something like the ear tags that monitor temperature, it's understanding that, okay, what do I do if that device starts showing that the calf has an elevated temperature? What's the most appropriate treatment? Because one of the things that's highlighted by a lot of studies, and this is work that was done at the same time as the previous study I showed in terms of the impact of pneumonia on weight gain, what they looked back on was the treatment records, and summed up here is the fact that, okay, they looked at the lung damage. Again, those animals that had normal lungs, no sign of lung damage, those ones with moderate and those ones with severe lung damage. And they looked back through the medical records of those animals to see whether or not they'd been treated for pneumonia. And I think on this graph, you've got the blue is animals that were treated, and then the yellow is the animals that were not treated. And the normal mild, we've sort of got a 50, sort of almost 55, 30, 45 split between treated and not treated. So a lot of them, as we'd expect, not treated because wouldn't have had disease, or were treated, and may well be the fact that they were treated and resolved completely, or as an opportunity in that sector to look at whether or not the animals needed treatment in the first place. I think the more worrying aspect on the graph is the sort of that bottom yellow percent of those animals. That's 30% of the severe animals and perhaps 50% of the moderate cases, where at slaughter we had animals with very distinct lung lesions, so 100% those animals had respiratory disease during their life, but there was no evidence of them being treated. And I think we need to sort of view that as almost an opportunity to sort of look back and go, right, what is it we're using as our case definition? How are we identifying cases? Because those are potentially animals that should have been treated, that we need to be getting on and treating and sort of minimizing the impact of the disease on. So those are the ones that we should be really focusing on as the missed treatments. Because where are we at in terms of, and this is one of the last slides I just want to talk about, conscious that there's lots of messages out there at the moment in terms of antimicrobial use. Certainly in the beef sector, young stock would be an area where we see a large numbers of treatments where potentially antibiotics get used, pneumonias, some people will be using it in certain instances for cases of scours, and then also sort of the diseases we see less often, naval ills, those kind of things. But I think there is the message out there that we need as an industry to be looking at what we're doing in terms of our antimicrobial usage. This graph sort of sums up what goes on in terms of the antibiotic usage. On the right-hand side, what was banned a number of years back was the use of antibiotics as growth promoters. So that's something that doesn't go on in the industry and is illegal. And as we move over to the left, we should be moving more to the fact that we should be using antibiotics and antimicrobials purely for the treatment of disease. So it's making sure that actually when we're treating animals, we are treating them correctly. So think about cases of pneumonia. How are you identifying them? Making sure that you've got an accurate diagnosis and that you're getting in there rapidly. And I think what I would encourage people to do is don't take the message about antimicrobial resistance to be one that actually all you should be doing is instantly cutting what antibiotics you use on farm. If an animal needs treatment, it should be treated, and there's a good ethos. It's in terms of antimicrobial usage, which is as little as possible but as much as necessary. So the long-term impact of not treating an animal that needs treatment, we've seen in terms of the impact on the performance of that animal, but actually under-treating, not finishing a course of antibiotics, not getting in early can lead to the fact that that disease will potentially spread through the group, and you end up then having a group outbreak or a more severe disease that actually in the long term leads to a much greater use of antibiotics. And so in calf rearing, what you should be doing, making sure you're getting good, accurate disease recognition. Certainly you should be moving away, and certainly I think in the current climate and the current thinking is that actually we shouldn't be routinely just treating animals in the absence of disease. So what's on here is the prophylaxis, so that prevention therapy. So people that are treating animals immediately on arrival as a preventative, that's something that we should be moving away from as an industry, which shouldn't be necessary, and it's thinking about other ways of minimizing the impact of stressors. So is it that going down, providing nutritional support immediately after transport for those calves, so thinking about electrolyte therapy to reduce stress, what's going on in the environment, the use of vaccination to try and reduce antibiotic usage, but when it is necessary, get in at the right time, always follow the dose rate, and agree protocols with your veterinary surgeon. There are certain classes of antimicrobials which the industry is really keen to reduce, and those are the fluoroquinolones, the third and fourth generation cephalosporins, and those are ones, if you don't know what those products are or what the trade names of those products are, have that conversation with your vet and really think about what steps you can be doing to phase those out, look at alternative products, but also think about benchmarking and what you're doing in terms of your treatments to try and reduce them long term. So been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We've gone through a bit of colostrum management, talked a bit about milk replacers, individual versus paired housing, hygiene and pneumonia. I'll take some questions now, and hopefully Amy has collated questions as they come in through the presentation.
That's great. Thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, if anybody's got any questions, just type them into the box on the right-hand side of your screen now. I'll just wait for a few of those to come through. Just whilst I'm waiting, I'd just like to remind you all that tonight's webinar has been recorded, so it'll be available on the AHDB YouTube channel in due course. You'll all get an email through to tell you that it's there. And just to remind you that there's a whole host of resources on the AHDB Beef and Lamb and the AHDB Dairy websites surrounding calf health and calf rearing, so go and have a look at those if you want to know any more. Okay, hang on then, let's have a look. We have our beef calves in individual pens on whole milk and our dairy heifers on automatic feeder on milk replacer. The calves on machine get crypto every year, but we never have it in the beef calves. What can we do to try and tackle the crypto on the machine calves?
So I suppose the crypto, it's going to be crypto in terms of real sort of management is always going to be a hygiene thing. So it's going to be looking at what you can do in terms of regular cleaning of the machine, making sure that sort of that the machine is thoroughly cleaned repeatedly, and also looking at what you're doing in terms of that pen management. And I suppose it's a sort of there's obviously the animals are coming from the same environment, but then the machine is obviously facilitating the sort of potential transfer of those animals between the calves. So I would be looking at cleaning the machine, regular cleaning of the teats, and making sure you're reducing that. Looking at what's going on in terms of drainage around the machine and all the feed stations to make sure you're minimising any the sort of potential areas of anything that's going to contribute to fecal oral contamination, so feces from one calf getting into the mouth of another. The other thing to think about is to be just checking what you're doing in terms of colostrum management and seeing whether there's any difference there in terms of sort of, is it the fact that the whole milk, so that bit of prolonged feeding is sort of those calves, the beef calves are getting a bit of a top up over a period, and actually the dairy heifers need a bit more colostrum.
Okay, thank you. What are your thoughts on using non-steroidals as primary treatments for pneumonia, given that most primary pneumonia agents are viral and bacterially secondary? Thinking about this in terms of welfare, and reducing the effect on growth rates.
So, great question. A real big proponent of the use of non-steroidals in calf pneumonia, and absolutely, I think you've hit the nail on the head. When we talk about calf pneumonia, frequently what we find in these animals is that there's potentially a viral course. And I suppose the best analogy is, it was like, think of it with ourselves. Often when we have a cold or the flu, what is it we reach for first? We don't reach for an antibiotic in our out of our sort of meds cabinet in our bathroom. We reach for the non-steroidal. So that Nurofen is that's the sort of closest analogy to that non-steroidal. So I've got a big proponent of this. I've certainly got a number of clients that I work with where what we've started doing is that animal in its initial stages. So immediately you notice it off feed, if it's got a temperature that is sort of a little bit of perhaps a clear nasal discharge, and that's where sometimes the objective scores can be quite useful, because you can start building a scoring system. You go, okay, in the mild diseases where we haven't necessarily got evidence of sort of bacterial involvement, so we haven't got the sort of yellow snot or sort of that sort of bacterial overgrowth, instant sort of going in with a non-steroidal very quickly, but then also monitoring those animals, and then potentially thinking about, okay, having a point at which you go, it would be worthwhile, this is the cutoff. If it hasn't improved within 12 hours, 24 hours, it may be that we do need to go with an antibiotic. And I think that's something to discuss with the vet and have a clear protocol. What are my cutoffs? What are the signs I treat with a non-steroidal first? And at what stage do I move on to an antibiotic? And I've got clients that will certainly have cut down probably the number of they'll probably about a third of animals that they would have treated with an antibiotic and non-steroidal, that they've got to a point where they can go, well, actually, we picked them up early, we just gave them a non-steroidal, and they didn't need the antibiotic treatment. But it needs careful refinement, because what you don't want to do is push it too far the other way and sort of hold off treatment where actually the antibiotics are necessary.
Excellent. How much crypto comes from the water supply? Should we be putting UV filters on stock water supplies?
I suppose there's always a potential that it could come from the water supply. It would depend on whether you're using mains or borehole water, and I suppose that's something, if you're really concerned about the quality of the water, that would be something to actually investigate and actually have samples analysed. There is some work done in terms of sort of the use of filters to reduce the potential challenge, and certainly been involved with some disease outbreaks where it's specifically coming in through contaminated water. But I think it's as if before going down that line, it would be looking at making sure you've identified it truly as that's what the source is, because a lot of it will be coming from the adults and sort of be picked up on farm, and then will then potentially be circling through calves later on.
Okay. How long do you advise leaving a calf on a cow after birth, and I suppose what are the risk factors of letting them suckle?
Good question. I suppose this will depend on people's systems. On the dairy system, there's certainly work out there done that's sort of bearing between anything up to a quarter of animals that are left on their mum won't always receive adequate amount of colostrum. So that becomes a big sort of driver for people potentially looking at moving animals off the mum and intervening earlier. So if you've got the facilities that those calf and the mum can be housed in a clean environment, that you're not concerned about managing other disease risks such as yonies and things, absolutely sort of leaving on the mum can have positive effects. It's a much more natural sort of emulation of sort of feeding behavior. The calf can go backwards and forwards and sort of have multiple smaller feeds, but it's thinking about what the long-term impact is in terms of what the adjustment if that calf is going to be taken off to be reared artificially at some point. We often find that the transition is harder onto teat-based systems if they've been suckling for a cow for a long time. There's potentially more risk in terms of fecal contamination, and actually the colostrum, the sort of debate about the colostrum feeding in often situations are that actually even if we're going to leave that calf on the mum for that 24-hour period, it may be worthwhile that you actually give an additional colostrum feed, so either just topping up that calf, because left to their own devices, certainly if animals have had difficult calvings, if that calf has had any kind of stress in that first hours of life, or the pen is not set up so that the calf can end up suckling off another cow or something like that, what you can end up with is a calf not receiving adequate colostrum.
Okay, thank you. Not a massive issue in this country, but we have had a bit of a spell of hot weather. How much impact can high temperatures have on the live weight gains in calves?
Certainly can have a negative impact on it, and I think it's a sort of what we've seen is it will potentially reduce intakes and sort of on voluntary type systems. So we've certainly seen it where actually the hotter weather recently is as animals sort of tending to not take as much. There's also the risk of stress, and certainly for sort of people that are on systems whereby they're sourcing calves and they're having to transport, it's thinking about what the impact that has on it. So transporting through this hot weather, certainly what we've seen as veterinary surgeons is that we've ended up with potential negative impacts on those calves as they've moved into rearing units. So think about things that you can do to alleviate that. Probably it's a sort of ventilation systems can help. Also thinking about, well, if we've got hot weather, we're transporting calves, thinking about the fact that, okay, those calves are much more likely to be slightly dehydrated. So thinking about providing extra electrolytes can help reduce the negative impact on daily live weight gain, and also and reduce the likelihood of disease following that period of stress.
Great, thank you. What should our targets be for weaning calves in terms of age and weight?
So various target weight, the targets will probably depend a little bit on what your the exact breeding of your animals are. Certainly, probably a lot of people will be going. If we take an animal that's say on a calf rearing system that you'll say we're looking at about 6 weeks on milk, 0.7 of a kilo daily live weight gain. So, and then sort of weaning at that sort of after say 42 days would be sort of where I would be aiming for it. So it depends on what site, if we're talking on a dairy heifer system or on a calf rearing system. But I think sort of aim for that daily live weight gain. Weaning sort of, as I say, probably that sort of 6 to 8 weeks would be your target, at which point you're almost getting to the stage of actually you're probably almost doubling your calf's birth weight you're close on to doubling the calf's birth weight by the time you hit weaning.
Brilliant, thank you. going back to grams per litre in terms of milk feeding, is there a point where you will run into the risk of nutritional scours in terms of grams per litre? And also, is there a certain amount of water that we need to include in the milk in terms of health?
So where probably it's a sort of, if you think about it, 125 grams per litre is pretty much the sort of similar kind of consistency to what you'd get from whole milk. There's certainly work out there where people are taking it up to 175, and I've certainly come across people feeding even a little bit higher. I probably wouldn't want to go much over that, and there's a lot of people that would probably feed it about the 150 grams per litre as a standard. In terms of the sort of the water aspect of it, I would always encourage people to don't necessarily view milk as the sort of source of water for calves, and I think it's very important that certainly in calf rearing systems, what are we trying to do with that calf? We're trying to provide nutrition with the milk, but we're also trying to provide a system whereby it's going to move on to hard feed. And what we need to do in that situation is get that animal used to drinking water as well. So it's always having fresh water supply. So don't view it as the fact that you're reducing the sort of water intake through the milk. I would also view water as almost as an extra nutrient that needs to be available all the time alongside the sort of the provision of milk. So we would encourage people to always have clean drinkers, clean fresh water, so the calves have access to that alongside access to milk. So almost view it as a separate nutrient, because at the end of the day, the figures are out there where if we want a calf to be, say, taking a kilo or so of hard feed, it needs to be taking in the region of 5 litres of water to achieve that. It's a bit like me asking someone to eat a whole bag of biscuits without aspects of sort of having the liquid to sort of be able to go through that. So we do need to get them to a stage of sort of taking water as well. So I wouldn't view it as a welfare aspect of sort of minimising sort of water within milk.
Okay, great, thank you. What are your thoughts on calf coats? Are they worth buying?
Calf coats worked. Managed well, work really well. As long as you observe the sort of core rules in terms of hygiene, so making sure they're clean between calves. I think AHDB have got some guidelines online, exactly sort of give you good guidance on when and how to use them. They're a great way of sort of supporting younger calves that have got potentially are suffering from disease. So if you imagine you've got a scouring calf, they're a great way of sort of providing that extra bit of protection in colder weather. Base principles: the jacket goes on, calf should be clean and dry before it goes on. You wouldn't want to put the calf jacket onto a wet calf. So if calf's been out in the field and you're bringing it in or whatever, and because it's damp and you want to warm it up, dry it first before the jacket goes on. You don't want to sort of trap a layer of moisture around that calf. Clean jacket, and that jacket stays on that one calf, and then it's cleaned after it before it's get used on another one. And would suggest that once a calf jacket goes on, it almost stays on that calf until probably around weaning, or until sort of calf outgrows it. Certainly in cold weather, what we'd be looking at doing is people taking calf jackets off in the morning. So the idea being that actually you're taking it off at a period where you're not suddenly you haven't taken off when the ambient temperature is going to be suddenly dropping. So if you take it off in the morning, it then has the day before it gets into the night time where the temperature will drop off a lot to adjust to life without it. But definitely worth the investment. And certainly we've seen a lot of people performing very well, and it provides a great tool for aiding performance.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We'll just do one last question, I think. What are your thoughts on rearing young calves at pasture rather than in sheds, particularly in spring and summer? In New Zealand, most calves are turned out to pasture early on in life, and they don't get so much pneumonia because of better ventilation. Should we be doing more of this in the UK?
So managed well. Certainly, I've know some people that it works for. I think it's going back down to ensuring the base principles are there. So it's having adequate sort of shelter there, that if the weather turns bad, we're not going to shock those calves. Having some shelter or some protection from the elements, because ultimately if we suddenly throw them out into wet weather, into the wind, and they're unprotected, we will have a negative impact on their growth rates. But absolutely, there's a lot of fresh air and things like that. If managed well, it helps us reduce. It's going to reduce the sort of disease challenge in terms of pneumonia. One thing to think about in terms of disease is certainly what you'd have to think about is sort of, you wouldn't want it necessarily in a very confined small paddock, or if you are doing it on that system, there's always think about what can be done potentially in rotational systems, so that actually that you're resting paddocks, because otherwise potential is that you'd get sort of build up of things like crypto and things on that area. And it's also thinking about how you manage dry feed intakes. I've certainly seen systems come unstuck where you sort of having dry feed outside, it's making sure that it's kept dry, it's kept palatable, and that if you've got an area of shelter, that the dry feed is in or around that, so that actually if the weather does change, the calves still are voluntary going up for those to take onto the hard feed to get them sort of to build up that intake. Because if it's massively separated, the tendency would be that the animals shelter away from that and sort of won't get the intakes that we want.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for that. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us this evening, and thank you to everybody for listening. We've had a really good turnout and participation. So I'll just remind you again, it will be available on the YouTube channel shortly, and you'll get a link through when that's up and running. Thank you very much, and enjoy your evening.